All right, so we've been talking about agriculture, and largely up to now we've been talking a lot about the history of agriculture and kind of how it's changed across time. And what I'd like to do now is talk a little more about the geography of agriculture, which is to say what types of agriculture do we tend to see where. So I've got this lecture about less developed countries and a second lecture about more developed countries, just to kind of look at and see what types of agriculture you see where and where you would expect those products to ultimately end up. The slides are largely designed to accompany the book The Cultural Landscape, and I am, of course, your lecturer, Ms. Gall. So the first thing you got to know a little bit of is what types of agricultural regions do we see and where do we see them. So our map here actually looks at a little bit at climate, because climate's a huge part of what type of agriculture can you have where. Okay, so most agricultural regions in LDCs fall into a handful of categories, and the first one we're going to talk about is what's called shifting cultivation. Okay, and shifting cultivation is most prevalent in those low latitude and for this purposes of this map, A-type climates. So A-type climates are kind of our mustard yellow ones. Okay, so they're humid, and that creates certain conditions that make it easier, for lack of a better term, to go ahead and engage in shifting cultivation. And so there's a handful of major features that we want to talk about with shifting cultivation. One is that the land is only tended to for a few years at a time. So we clear some land, we grow on it for a few years, and then we move to the next plot of land. Okay, so shifting cultivation is not the same thing as pastoral nomadism, where we're moving around herds. Okay, this is fixed cultivation for a set length of time, a few years. That land, we often clear it by doing what's called slashing and burning. As the name implies, slash and burn agriculture literally means that you cut down all of the trees and other plants in an area, and then you burn it. And the reason why you burn the trees and stuff and grasses and so forth not only is to go ahead and just clear them, but also because in a lot of these humid low latitude climates, the soil is not particularly healthy. It's not got a lot of nutrients in it, and so by burning those plants and trees and things, what it does is adds a lot more nutrients into the soil and makes the soil good to grow things on for a few years. Okay, the types of crops grown this way will vary from region to region, so it's really just going to depend. Oftentimes, interestingly enough, we see, for instance, in South America, a lot of cattle herding is done this way. So they'll clear the land, grow some grass on it, and then when the land tires out, they'll move on. In Asia, you might see rice grown this way. Okay. As well, it's important to know that traditionally, historically, the land is not owned individually, but rather collectively. So it's a family group or a village group that's tending to this area and then moving when it's time to move. So it's not, me and my spouse doing it, it's me and my extended family doing it, or me and my village doing it. The other major type of agricultural region we need to talk about is herding domestic animals, and these are primarily found in our arid or semi-arid climates. Arid, by the way, is just a fancy schmancy word that means dry. So arid climates are dry, semi-arid are somewhat dry. And for purposes of our map, these are our B-type climates, so we're going to find them in the Midwestern United States, parts of Argentina, large parts of Northern Africa, some of Southern Africa, much of Australia, okay, and on down the list. In this case, the animals are not, generally speaking, eaten. At least not eaten by the people who are keeping them. The size of the herd is an indicator of power and prestige. So you don't want to kill off animals more often than you have to, just because to do so then would lower your prestige within the community and ultimately your power. So the type of animal you'll see will depend on which region we're talking about. So for example, if we're talking about North Africa or Southwest Asia, we might find camels. Okay, and then what you also see by some pastoral nomads are transhumanists. And transhumanists is just when you're moving from place to place, taking those herds with you, but it's across a broader region. So much agriculture, when we're talking about planting, is intensive subsistence agriculture. And intensive subsistence agriculture tends to be found in areas with high populations and high agricultural density. So particularly East, South, and Southeast Asia are great examples of this. And then with the goal of maximizing production, little to no land is wasted. So literally you'll see mountainsides in Asia where what they've done is carved up the mountainside into steps and created terraces so that in the process they could grow land on those terraces. Okay, probably the most intensive subsistence crop in particularly in Asia is rice, especially in Southeast Asia. And within that we come across really two regions. One where what's called wet rice is dominant, and one where wet rice is not dominant. And wet rice literally means, and you can kind of see this in the pictures on our slide here, where the plants are actually grown in standing water. Okay, so that's called a wet rice because it's grown in water. Wet rice not dominant. You might find drier varieties of rice that grow better in slightly drier conditions. You also, especially in China and the like, you'll find a lot of wheat production. So if one of those lesser known factors about China is there's the rice part of China and there's the noodle part of China. And the noodle part of China gets a lot of their calories from wheat being turned into noodles. So if we're looking and going to go back to rice production, okay, and got a world map here just to show you a little bit about it. If we're looking at metric tons, okay, which is a great way to measure stuff like this, what you can look and see is there's certain areas where it's very, very intense and they grow a lot of rice, right? India, China, not surprising, okay? Little bitty country that I'm forgetting, I think is probably Bangladesh. And then, so they're like the big ones. They're like 100 million metric tons per year. That's a lot of rice. And then you've got kind of your medium-sized growers, and these are the ones we're going 10 to 99 million metric tons, right? And that's where the Brazil falls into that category, interestingly enough. Parts of Papua New Guinea, parts of Southeast Asia, right? Malaysia and the like, Vietnam, and so forth. And then you've got your folks who grow a little bit, not a ton, a little bit. And that's like the US, 1.1 to 9.9 million metric tons, right? Lots of South America, some parts of Africa. And then you got areas where they just don't grow rice at all. And to some degree this makes sense, right? They don't grow rice in Australia. Australia's not exactly humid. Large parts of Africa, probably not humid enough to support it, right? And some parts of South America, which I would guess actually the trick is just that it's not a staple part of the diet. So one other big thing we need to talk about, we talk about agricultural regions in less developed countries, okay? And that is to say plantation farming. And plantation farming is large, typically monocropped farms. We often find them in Latin America, Africa, Asia, lesser developed areas. And these are where they grow large quantities of products, but they're typically sold in the more developed countries. Okay, and that's what that acronym MDC means, is more developed countries. Most plantations specialize in one or two what are called cash crops, and they're called that because the goal is to sell them. Okay, it's a type of commercial agriculture. Some of the most important cash crops and plantation crops are things like coffee, sugarcane, cotton, rubber, tobacco. For the most part, not necessarily crops you can eat. Okay, it requires a large labor force, typically of some degree of skill. Okay, and usually they do these in sparsely settled regions, and sparsely just means they don't have a lot of people. And the reason for that is that plantation agriculture requires a lot of land in order to produce in the quantities that are needed. So that's our lecture about agriculture in less developed countries. And just to recap, we talked a little bit about plantation agriculture, talked a little bit about intensive subsistence agriculture and rice. We talked about pastoral nomadism, okay, and herding. And then we also talked about slash and burn agriculture, and we didn't talk about it, but we should have, how that can really change the environment. So if you've got any questions at all, please feel free to come see me or ask them during class, and I'd be delighted to do what I can to answer those questions.